Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Lee Panglia and I'm the head of CIPD in Scotland and Northern Ireland. And I am delighted to be hosting today's session on the role of COVID-19 testing as part of our Returning to the Workplace series. It's great that so many of you can join us this afternoon for what I suspect is an especially important topic for all of you today. As lockdown measures begin to ease and plans are made for more of us to return to our normal place of work in some form or another, there's much discussion within organisations about workplace testing, and I'm sure you'll have noticed the great media interest in this topic too. There's lots of factors for us to take into account, and today we'll consider some of the practicalities and legal implications organisations should consider so that you can understand how best to implement testing if it's appropriate within your own organisation. So I am joined today by a panel of three great speakers who can each bring a different perspective to the discussion through sharing insights, evidence, and some practical examples. So I'd like to introduce them to you now. Paddy Smith, my colleague, leads CIPD UK's Public Affairs team. Paddy's role and his team's role is to build relationships with policymakers, to raise the voice of the profession, to drive positive change in the workplace across many areas, including obviously our COVID-19 response. Before joining the CIPD, Paddy worked in Parliament as a researcher. I'm also joined today by Matt Reymes-Cole. Matt is an employment law consultant with Croner and leads a team advising clients of all sizes and across all industry sectors on all aspects of employment law. And last but not least, Kate Palmer is an HR advice and consultancy director with Peninsula. Prior to joining Peninsula, Kate worked in senior HR roles in global facilities services. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. So before we get started on the content of today, there's some practical things that I need to go through with you. The session is being recorded and will be available on demand via the webinar section of the CIPD website, where you can access not only this webinar, but also all previous webinar recordings and sign up for future ones too. Our next session is next week on the 18th of March, and it's on fairness post-COVID, and it includes areas such as how to address reward and recognition. You will all be muted, and we have a panel discussion at the end, and we would love for you to submit questions. To submit questions to the panel, you need to type into the Q&A box, not the chat box, because that won't be checked for questions. And you can use the chat box to network with fellow attendees, although do remember to use all panellists and attendees so that you can share with everyone. But for the purpose of questions, if you please type into the Q&A box. So there's some member benefits and additional resources that I would like to draw your attention to before we go any further. In particular, some of the additional resources that can support you in this role. On our Coronavirus Hub, we are updating our FAQs and resources all the time as new information becomes available. So I do recommend that you regularly go to the CIPD Coronavirus Hub for more resources for CIPD members. I'd also like to draw your attention to the fact that CIPD members can get individual legal advice by calling our HR Inform helpline, which is available 24/7. And then finally, if we go into our next slide, CIPD members in the UK and Ireland can also access our new Wellbeing Hub and helpline. Together with award-winning workplace wellbeing provider, Health Assured, we now provide CIPD members with free help and support 24/7 and 365 days a year by telephone or online consultations with qualified therapists. Members can access the phone number and the online services via the membership benefits webpage. You'll see more details about this at the end of the session. We also have an unlimited free 24/7 confidential telephone helpline, online portal and health eHub app. Okay, so now to get on to the content of this discussion. Paddy will be joining us as our first speaker, followed by Matt, and then we will finish off with Kate. We'll then open up for questions for the remainder of the session. So as I said earlier, if I can encourage you to post questions for the panel into the Q&A box. So that's it from me for now, and I'm going to hand over to Paddy to get us started. Thank you, Paddy.
Thanks very much, Lee. Yes, so my job, as Lee's introduced, my role and what I'm going to be doing is just to provide, sort of set the scene really in terms of what's available in terms of testing and a few of the sort of practical considerations. So if I could have my first slide, please. First, I did see a question pop up just beforehand, so I'll just address that. We're very much aware that there's a mosaic of different dates and when restrictions across the devolved nations. So what I'm going to be doing, there are some dates that my slides will refer to, but I'm very much aware that there are different dates in other countries, and I will address them throughout. But so just initially, just what is a question? Why test? And I mean, ultimately, we need to pick up the virus where it is and isolate those that are infected. And quite one of the strange things with this, with the virus, is that 1 in 3 cases are asymptomatic, and therefore widespread testing is important. So you can pick those people who have the virus without knowing, and encourage them to isolate to bring overall numbers down. There are a number of reasons why employers may consider in-work testing, such as managing workforce risk or putting employees' minds at ease so that it's a safe environment for them to come into work. But ultimately, as we sort of enter these easing of restrictions across the UK, we ensure that staff are able to return and ultimately keep businesses open, because it's been such a difficult time for a large number of businesses. Once they do have the opportunity to reopen, those that have been shut, it provides peace of mind. And ultimately, if the testing regime is handled well, it can give employees and customers confidence and protect businesses once they are open. There are several aspects to consider in doing so. I'm going to focus more on the practical ones, and I'm sure Matt will look at the legal ones. So I have the next slide, please. First, this one may come as just a bit of a disclaimer, but ultimately, even if you were to introduce testing tomorrow, that doesn't ensure, it doesn't allow workplaces to avoid following the national and regional restrictions in place and good guidance. Specifically to England, the work from home order remains until the 29th of March. I know that I think there's a target date in Scotland for the 5th of April to allow stay-at-home order to be lifted. But going back to England, even after that, the work from home guidance will stay in place until June at the earliest. So ultimately, even if you were to introduce testing once you can reopen, they're certainly not superseded by, they don't supersede the restrictions still in place. Even if testing is adopted, employers must follow all such steps, including HSE guidance and staff and safety and risk assessments. And workplaces must still follow the guidance. If you go on the central.gov.uk website, there are 14 different pieces of guidance covering things such as PPE, ventilation, other areas. And so still, and the risk that biggest risk we've identified is that false confidence for those of you who have a testing regime to pick people up that have the virus, that other sort of guidance might fall by the wayside. But certainly from our point of view, we just want to ensure that it's one part of the armoury and reopening when we can, and bringing people back to work safely. So we have the next slide, please. So there's what testing is available through government. Again, there are various ones which I'll address where I can, but in England, there was a news only this weekend that workplace testing is now available for all businesses. Previously, it was only 250 and above. Then it moved to 50 and above. And actually just, I think it was Saturday, it was announced that any employer can join the scheme in England. For that, there is a online portal that you can register interest up until 31st of March. And for companies that do that, the test will be free up until June. It remains to be seen whether or not that that date moves when alongside when various phases have gone through in the reopening. But for the time being, they want expressions of interest by the 31st of March. Apparently, there's only 14,000 have registered interest, and 3,500 have been approved, and those schemes being put in place. There are various schemes, as I said, in developed nations. I know in Scotland, for example, there's a real focus on what they term at-risk businesses. So they're looking at food production, abattoirs. But yeah, and there's various different schemes, and we within our resources we provide the relevant details. Of course, there is other businesses can also look at doing it themselves, funding it privately themselves, but for businesses there is government support and to bring testing into the workplace. So we have the next slide, please. So this one here, I took up a lot of my weekends looking at different tests, which I didn't think it would, but the government scheme uses lateral flow tests, and these are quite prominent in England. Schools have gone back today, and there are requirements around testing. They use these lateral flow tests as well, and ultimately it's because they allow rapid testing because they're comparably cheap and quick compared to others. The idea with them, they're compared to pregnancy tests where you get the result within 30 minutes. However, there are, for those that do test positive, it has to be then confirmed with what's known as a PCR, polymerase chain reaction test, which is lab-based and takes longer. But the idea with the lateral flow tests is that because they are so quick, that they allow people to be tested quickly. However, there are a number of questions that these raise. Certainly, I think Matt may wonder what it means in terms of the time taken, whether it's working time. So if you're looking at national minimum wage, national living wage rates, the accuracy of lateral flow tests, they are known to provide a lot of false negatives, which is a risk. Logistics as well. If you've got a big organization and a large number of people to be testing, there's a logistical considerations. And the point I made before, false confidence, if you think you're testing and therefore you're okay, runs the risk of getting complacent and allowing other steps to fall by the wayside. And we've got a full FAQ sheet on the CIPD website, which I refer you to. I can have the next slide, please. So from a practical point of view, engagement with the workforce is vitally important. General consultation with staff is advisable before implementing a testing policy. So you may want to speak to an employee, whichever formats you have. But matters to address during this consultation will include why the organisation thinks that steps over and above the existing test and trace are thought necessary, whether the testing is voluntary or mandatory, and where staff stand if they refuse testing. The whole process, as I mentioned, for example, the logistics should be explained, including the delivery of the result and the steps after receiving a test result. The next slide, please. From our point of view, we suggest that employers certainly consider a written coronavirus policy on testing. This could interact with other policies that covering discipline, grievance, absence, diversity, and discrimination. Policies set out who will be tested, how often they'll take place, and acting on, I mentioned this before, acting on what happens with results. And we do have a sample policy available on HR Inform. The next slide, please. Vitally important part of the policy is what happens if someone tests positive. So for a lot of people, if they are able to work from home, that seems possible, seems advisable if they can. Obviously, if you test positive, the guidance is to isolate for 10 days. However, for a large number of people that aren't able to work from home, it does provide an issue. We know from our own research that the biggest factor why people may refuse testing is if they're unclear of what if they think they're going to lose out financially. So this is something that employers should certainly consider, whether or not it's looking at the NHS test and treat isolation payments, which is something we've looked at in detail, whether or not you offer occupational sick pay, or whether or not it would be statutory sick pay rates. And as I said, this is something really vitally important to communicate, just so employees know where they stand if they do test positive and will have to miss work. Next slide, please. Oh, that's me done. I had one more, but so that's just a few of the practical insights from us, and we've got lots of resources available to guide you through. But I'll just pass back to Lee.
Oh, thank you, Paddy, for that. I mean, without a doubt, there's many considerations, many things that organisations need to consider when looking at the option of testing within the workplace. So I'm now going to pass you over to Matt, and Matt is going to touch on some of the many legal aspects to consider. So over to you, Matt. Thank you.
Thanks, Lee. Thanks, Paddy. Afternoon, all. So yeah, we've heard from Paddy in terms of why obviously we want to be looking at introducing testing. I think effectively a lot of the impetus for employers is wanting to do the morally right thing, or just part of wider society, really, just in essence doing our bit. It is actually unsurprisingly underpinned slightly by a legal requirement as well. Sort of goes without saying. But if we can move on to the next slide. In terms of sort of testing within the workplace, I mean, really what this is about, or the perspective of the employer, is that we are under an obligation, obviously, to ensure that our employees have a safe working environment, and not only for themselves, but then also for their colleagues and also third parties that they're coming into contact with. It's easy to assume in some ways that workplaces are very sparse with very few people living there, but in some sectors they're still open and fully functioning, if you think retail, for example. So it's not only ourselves, it's also those that our workforce are coming into contact with, and wanting to make sure that we're providing a safe environment for all, which is obviously underpinned from a workplace point of view in the Health and Safety at Work Act, which requires us to ensure a safe environment so far as is reasonably practicable. Now, obviously, in terms of sort of exercising that or ensuring that we've met our obligation there, asking people to work from home, which is the current government requirement in terms of the work from home order, is obviously going to eliminate the risk of people either becoming infected or passing on the infection within work itself. Clearly, if people aren't physically together, then you can't pass on the virus. Obviously, where that's not possible, then as employers, we're obliged to ensure that we are putting into place a COVID secure environment. So as part of that, we'll obviously have undertaken a COVID-19 secure risk assessment, which obviously needs to be done and should have been done some time ago now, as far as the pandemic's concerned. And then we need to keep that under continual review to ensure that that is still meeting the needs and that we're still doing what we should be in terms of protecting everybody. Obviously, some of the control measures that are in place are those things that should be pretty familiar to all of us by now. So it's things like ensuring social distancing, so the 2 metre rule, or the 1 metre plus rule if we're not able to ensure 2 metres, ensuring that there's other control measures in place. Hand sanitising, introducing hand sanitising stations, reminders for individuals, signage, prompts, all of those sorts of things to ensure that people are washing their hands and sanitising them at all the appropriate opportunities. Cleaning of communal areas as well, if there are shared meeting rooms that are still in use, breakout areas if they're still necessary, ensuring that they are cleaned regularly, and that measures are in place to, again, stop the spread between individuals who are not physically contacting each other but are coming into contact effectively through the same workspace. And then obviously the use of face masks, not necessarily compulsory sort of around the environment, but something that it's certainly worth considering, again, in communal areas when people are away from their desks and those sorts of things, in office environments, or if they're away from their workstations in factory environments, moving around in warehouses and those sorts of things. Now, as part of this, obviously, testing may potentially form one part of our considerations in terms of meeting that health and safety requirement. Paddy made a very good point, though, which is that testing isn't the solution. And testing in itself doesn't actually replace all of the other control measures that we need to put into place. There are some limitations in terms of the efficacy of the testing that can be done. And the testing will only obviously give a bite-size point in time that confirms whether or not somebody is likely or unlikely to effectively have the virus. So it doesn't replace the other control measures that need to be in place across the rest of the week, and at all other times while people are in the environment. Okay, next slide, please. So looking at how we'd actually go about implementing testing with some of the sort of legalities in mind. I mean, really what we're aiming for here, for a few reasons, is consent. So if we can get the individuals to actually consent and willingly take part in the testing programme, that's going to be much better, obviously, in terms of workforce engagement and in actually getting the testing to run smoothly and seamlessly. But also from a legal point of view, if everybody is quite happy in there, willingly entering into the testing, we're going to run into much less in terms of legal implications, shall we say, or potential battles later on. So in terms of encouraging, the first thing that we really need to consider is if we're a unionised environment, if we've got a recognition agreement in place with unions, that we actually do undertake consultation with the trade unions or appropriate employee representatives. Now, short of a union environment, there's no specific requirement for consultation. And throughout the pandemic, things have been brought in relatively quickly, given the scenario and the issues, without the ability necessarily to go through that full consultation all of the time. But again, where we can, it's a good idea to consult with individuals, helps to ensure that the workforce feel engaged with it. And actually, it can perhaps help to iron out some of the issues that we might encounter in terms of pushback. Perhaps there's things that we haven't considered as managers that are fairly obvious to employees moving around the place, and conversations that are going on, and so on and so forth. Obviously, if we do have individuals that are sceptical or not wanting to take part completely, then we will need to discuss it with them to find out their reason for the refusal. This is going to, I'll come on to this in a moment, this is necessary in terms of if we are ultimately going to force this, but it's, in any event, it's really the first port of call. If an individual's not happy, it's common sense effectively to find out why they're not happy and to discuss that with them. There may be some rumours and things that we can dispel, just in terms of providing that further information. And alongside that is just making sure that we're assisting people's understanding by sharing accurate information, credible and reliable information, being honest about what we're doing and why. And that will really include the benefits for the individual, largely, their colleagues, clearly, but it's also those others that they're in close contact with in their personal life. So people that they're at home with, obviously this is for their benefit as well, if this is an added extra to try and identify those cases where people are asymptomatic, as we've said, but do actually have the virus and are therefore at risk of passing it on. Leading by example, so involve all those within the workplace. We actually have workplace testing here, and it's something that's done throughout the organisation. Everybody's involved with it. Consider when you conduct the tests as well. Clearly doing it within working time is going to be more palatable for individuals. You may find that a number of individuals are quite happy to give up some of their own time in order to undertake a test. I think generally around testing, there is a large amount of goodwill. So you may find that in a particular workforce that there is no issue with looking at doing a test earlier on outside of working time. But if not, then consider it in working time, or maybe looking at the time off in lieu of that as well. The pay aspect's an interesting one in terms of the time, depending on how much individuals are paid. Minimum wage legislation may kick in, and if you're ultimately requiring a test in order for somebody to work, and that's outside of their normal working time, you're effectively requiring them to undertake something that's work related, and so it's likely to count as working time for minimum wage purposes. And then also we should just consider the implications for those who are going to have to self-isolate following the test as well. So we obviously need to understand in advance, what are we going to be doing with those that have tested positive? It is likely to then require a PCR test to be done. It's likely that it's less likely that that will be workplace based. That may be something that needs to be accessed through the NHS. Clearly, with an indication that that person may currently have coronavirus, you're not going to want them around the building in the meantime. So we need to consider what we're going to do. Are they going to be able to switch to work from home? You know, what are we going to do in terms of pay during that period, and so on and so forth. Okay, next slide, please. So in terms of making it compulsory, do check the contract initially. I suspect that this is incredibly rare because pre-pandemic it wasn't, along with so many other things, really a consideration that you had when you were drafting a contract of employment, in truth. But in some sectors, there may be clauses within the contract whereby the individuals effectively already agreed to actually undergo testing where it's relevant to their role. So I'm thinking maybe in the care sector and so on and so forth, it may be something that you come across in contracts there. But as I say, I suspect it's generally going to be pretty unlikely. Without such a clause, or even with the clause though, then compulsion can carry risks. And forcing somebody to undertake a test isn't necessarily something that is always going to be justifiable from a legal point of view. And we are going to need to have that justification and that backup as to why we're doing it. In terms of those risk factors, I mean, the obvious one is an unfair dismissal or a constructive dismissal risk if we're forcing somebody to undertake the test on a regular basis, which is likely to be the case if it's against their wishes. From a dismissal point of view, clearly, if they're refusing, then the natural sort of conclusion to that refusal ultimately is recourse to the disciplinary procedure and potentially dismissal further down the line. Likely to be a dismissal on the basis of their conduct if they're refusing to follow what we consider to be a reasonable management instruction. Key point here is going to be reasonableness. That's going to be the determining factor. Our instructions got to be reasonable, and the employee effectively must be unreasonable in their refusal. That's obviously going to depend on the specific circumstances for each individual employer, the environment that the individual's working in, what COVID secure factors we're able to put into place, which ones we're not, which ones we're a little bit weaker on because of the environment. And therefore where testing may have a bit more of an impact in terms of us trying to ensure a safe working environment for everybody. Other factors would be things like the degree of risk involved in terms of those that the individual is coming into contact with, and possibly even the degree of risk for the individual themselves and their colleagues. So those that are at higher risk, it's going to be easier potentially to justify looking at testing where people are higher risk as part of a suite. But again, it's not necessarily going to be a golden ticket in essence as far as justification is concerned. But certainly if the individual is working with vulnerable adults, so again, if you think of care sector, then it may be easier to justify implementing testing there or making it compulsory. The question really is how much of an impact the testing will have in respect of the individuals that are likely to be refused or that are refusing. As we know, the lateral flow test is only indicative at that specific point in time. So as we've already said, the testing isn't the be all and end all, and therefore we're going to have to work relatively hard in terms of justifying it. And again, on what grounds is the individual refusing? That's going to be important in terms of our reasonableness test here. So understanding why the individual is ultimately saying no, can we alleviate those concerns? Are they genuine concerns? Are there ways that we could look to approach it in a different way that would alleviate it while still meeting the business need on the other hand? Okay, next slide, please. Discrimination in terms of the next factor, so the next possible risk factor that we run into. I think it's less likely to be an obvious issue as far as testing is concerned compared to vaccination. Mainly, and this may be my own slight naivety here, but I'm not personally aware of any religious beliefs that would necessarily preclude somebody from undergoing testing, given that the testing isn't actually sort of a medical procedure being carried out in respect of it affecting the individual. It is a swab, it's taking a sample and testing the sample. But as far as the individual is concerned, they've not received medical treatment. That said, that could be my naivety though, and always open to understanding things further. I think where it may become an issue is whether or not there is a wider argument around philosophical belief. So if an individual's refusing because of some more or a deeper concern relating to testing, or maybe coronavirus in general, in terms of people perhaps not accepting that it's real, that there's a genuine issue, or that the response is proportionate in terms of the issue as they see it. And then the question is whether that could potentially amount to a philosophical belief, and whether we run into an argument there. One probably to be determined by the courts, but historically they've looked at whether or not the belief is genuinely held, whether it's more than an opinion. It has to be a weighty and substantial aspect of human life and behaviour, so it can't just be a trivial thing to qualify as a philosophical belief. It's got to have a similar status or cogency to a religious belief, so there's got to be an element of a seriousness or cohesion about it. It's got to be worthy of respect in a democratic society as well, and not infringe on the rights of others. So again, it will very much turn on the individual's reasons and their rationale and what they are purporting to suggest at that point in time is their philosophical belief. And then clearly, just from an employee relations point of view as well, we've already touched on that in terms of if we are forcing individuals to take the test, then clearly that could have an impact. Oh, sorry. Oh, I think someone's accidentally unmuted themselves there. It's the opposite problem. Normally the mutes the problem itself. So next slide, please. So data protection. There's various guidance actually on the ICO website to do with a number of different topics around coronavirus, touching on all aspects of where COVID has had an impact, or where measures that have been put into place in response to COVID have data protection considerations. Now, clearly, this is going to be personal data. We are ultimately going to be collecting, whether we do the testing through processing the lateral flow test somehow ourselves, or whether we get a third party to do it, we are ultimately going to be storing information relating to individuals as a result of that testing being done. It's the whole point of doing the testing. Data that relates to health is also sensitive data, so it carries a bit more protection, so to speak, from a data protection point of view, in that it's considered to be special category data. This gets horrifically technical from a data protection point of view, but in short, there are additional conditions that have to be satisfied, and potentially additional safeguards that need to go alongside that. One of the special conditions, though, is consent. So if individuals consent, then you've met that special condition, and provided you're handling the data in a way that is minimising what you're storing and for how long for, and meeting legitimate reasons, and you're keeping it secure and everything else, then the ICO guidance ultimately makes the point that data protection itself is unlikely to be a barrier to testing. Data protection isn't there to prevent it from happening, it's just there to ensure that we are considering the data, why we're collecting it, do we need it, and what are we doing with it ultimately, and making sure that we're protected around that. Some of the points that they suggest considering are, again, what is the aim of collecting the data? Do we really need the information? What information is it that we actually require? Will these steps actually help to provide a safe environment? So again, doubling back to this point that this isn't going to be a replacement for everything else that's in place currently. Could we achieve the same result without collecting the personal information? So in particular, without health information. So, if it's just the test result that we need, do we need to know everything else medically about the individual at that point in time? Probably not. And do we have alternative methods of achieving the same aim? If we're satisfied that we do need to do the tests and everything else, then we just need to ensure that we're correctly storing and using the data. And ultimately, the ICO make the point that this is about clarity, openness, transparency, and honesty with employees. It's a bit of a theme that runs through everything, the practical and the legal considerations around all this. Next slide, please. So in terms of a workplace policy, Paddy mentioned this. So obviously, good idea to have one. It will help back up our explanation if ultimately we are tested on the back of a disciplinary process. What did we put into place? What process did we follow? We need a fair process in terms of how we go about implementing it if we are going to make it compulsory. And obviously implementing a policy can be a cornerstone of helping us on the road to showing that we're approaching this in a fair way. So the sort of things to consider would be why we're implementing the testing at all. So outlining what our obligations are and what we're seeking to achieve. What our stance is on employees being tested. Effectively, is it compulsory or is it voluntary? How will the testing actually be carried out? So who's going to do it? How will it be done? What type of test is it? And then what are the steps to be followed following the results? How are we going to deal with time off related to the testing? And how are we going to pay in relation to that time as well? And also, what are we going to pay in terms of isolation periods where people are unable to work from home? Dealing with the data protection aspects. So is it just going to be around consent and so on and so forth? And then how are we going to use and store the data? And then it's also a good idea as far as a specific testing policy is concerned to refer back to COVID secure safety measures as well that we've got in place. Back to you, Lee.
Okay, thank you, Matt. I did say that there were at the beginning, before you started talking, that there's many legal aspects to consider, and you definitely demonstrated that. And we've got some great questions to ask you later. But before we do that, I would really like to pass over to Kate now, who's going to tell us from a bit more of a kind of practice and experience point of view what Peninsula's experience has been in implementing some of this. So I'll pass over to Kate now. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lee. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to Matt and Paddy. They've covered off so many of the practical considerations there so nicely that I just want to bring it to life a little bit, really, and explain both as a HR professional, which I am, but also a manager of a team of HR professionals, how we've implemented it. But also, importantly, I get the test every Friday. So just to give you some practical insight into what that looks like and how it works and how it happens. So a bit of a different spin, which I hope helps with any decisions you guys are making. So first and foremost, we actually implemented testing back on the 4th of January here at Peninsula. We made our plans pre-Christmas. So we were quite early in terms of implementation. And we did that quite simply because we have about 20% of our workforce who cannot reasonably work from home, be it for the fact that they do a specific role, be it due to technology, be it due to Wi-Fi connection, be it due to mental health. So we have a wide range of contextual issues, meaning that we have that 20% remaining in the office. And quite simply, we want to make sure they're safe. We have an array of other measures in place, that the type of thing that Matt touched on there, one-way systems, we have car parking for people coming on public transport, we offer masks, everything that are in those 14 guides that Paddy touched on gov.uk, you know, we have taken the lead on that and we have implemented a whole host of different measures. But this is another thing to demonstrate to our people that we care, and that's why we've done it ultimately. And it has gone down particularly well because we've conveyed that message with some force, really, the benefits of such. We have chosen to use a third party, so we haven't tapped into any government initiatives as such. So it does cost us weekly. It isn't cheap, but that's a decision we've made. We see it as absolutely fundamental to the safety of this business. And importantly, it's a reassurance tool. One thing that I didn't expect really was worry from family members. So whilst some staff members are here and have to be here because they can't reasonably work from home, we had quite a few examples where their family members were worried about them being in. So not only does it act as a reassurance tool for our direct staff, but their wider family group, which I think is really important now for the fight against coronavirus and making people feel like they're as safe can be. The benefits, the key one quite clearly is the identification of asymptomatic individuals. We have had a handful of those. People, obviously, if they had symptoms, they would not be in, they should not be in. We would make sure that didn't happen. But we have had a handful of asymptomatic or people that are asymptomatic, testing positive. And clearly that's That's the fundamental benefit to introducing this, for the safety of themselves, the peers in the office and the business overall. And importantly, when those individuals are identified, we've treated that with extreme sensitivity, professionalism, and made sure they could get home safe and go and have a PCR test, because we're doing lateral flow tests, and do that in a professional and caring manner. The whole pitch of this is absolutely key to the success of your testing programme. We have in fact had positive feedback from staff. I personally was stopped in the ladies, where many a conversation happens in the ladies and gents, from one particular member of staff who was really thankful and well, thankful that we had introduced this. However, initially that wasn't the same from every staff member. As Matt touched on, there are specific circumstances, specific individuals who may have their own contextual reasons for resisting testing, be it a fear of having the test, which I'll come on to in a little while, be it, we had one individual that said they felt particularly silly doing it in front of people. We solved that. You know, there are an array of reasons why people may resist, payment being one, of course. And the important thing about allaying any fears or worries are those individual conversations. So for each person that wasn't agreeable at the outset to have the testing, or resisted in some way, or even if they were just nervous, we made sure we had a one-on-one discussion with those individuals, addressing what their concerns were and reassuring them really of the benefits of the test. One thing that caught me a bit left field, which in fact Matt has covered off, was some slight resistance on the data protection aspects of the situation. Something personally, to be honest, I didn't even contemplate would arise. But what we have to do is fill in a form in advance of our testing slot. And quite a few individuals did raise that as a concern. So what we arranged with that was that they would have a one-to-one with our GDPR officer to talk through where their data was going, all the complexities of GDPR, which Matt touched on, because it ain't a simplistic topic. And we were very lucky that right now, as it stands, that may change as people move back to the workplace as the roadmap evolves. But right now, everyone is having the test. And key to that is pitch. Key to that is people backing it and being on board at every level of this organisation. And key to that are your comms. So we'll touch on that in a little while. But certainly GDPR, data protection, was something that I wasn't particularly ready for. And if I could give you a tip, think of that as a potential obstruction and think about how you're going to address that and deal with that with the individuals who raise it. How have we implemented it? Some real practical insights into how we did this. It first went on the agenda at a pre-Christmas kind of board meeting as such, albeit it's a wider audience than that actually. We have a weekly COVID-19 meeting with the board and key senior stakeholders from across the business. And within that meeting, we had support at that level of the fact that this was a beneficial and a good way forward for our staff, their families and our business. So we got buy-in from all parties at the outset. Then the next step was who and how. So we reviewed various providers externally, obviously looking at how they would implement it, their processes, as well as cost. Let's not be naive to the fact that that is a factor for businesses, particularly in the challenging economic climate we're in now. And we agreed to work, or decided to work, should I say, with a particular third party who we are now, I suppose, partnering with throughout the programme. The way it works, so I'll give you myself as a case in point. On a Thursday, I get my form. I have my test on a Friday. We all have an allotted slot. Mine is at 9:45, that lovely Friday treat, I would say. You go down 5 minutes before your slot. Outside of the room where we have the testing, we have a social distanced queue with markers on the floor where you all have to stand. We go into the room, we sanitize, we have our own cubicles to ensure for privacy and sensitivity. And within your cubicle, you have your test, you have instructions on a screen, and you have a tissue and everything that's required. You leave your form there so you're not handing it to anyone. And what's really useful is every week we have a video played to us before we have the test. Now it might seem a little bit like overkill that, because I hasten to add, it does become like second nature. It really, really does. You're in and out in 30 seconds. But that's just reassuring every week to watch the same video, same consistent message to everyone. And as daft as it sounds, it's got nice relaxing music on playing in the background, and it just creates that sense of safety and reduces, certainly for me, any feelings of anxiety I've got about what is to come, which isn't pleasant. You are, without sounding too graphic, sticking something up your nose. It's not nice, but it doesn't hurt, and that's the important thing for your staff. It's not particularly intrusive. It's over and done within 30 seconds. You walk out a different route, you sanitize, you're back up at your seat by 10 to 10. Certainly I am on a Friday. And it really does become like second nature. What I would say, for a few people that have been worried about having the test, we've taken them down individually. We've showed them the environment, we've showed them the video, we've even given some people slots when other people aren't in the room because they felt slightly embarrassed doing it in front of people. So we've made it as comfortable and as safe and as reassuring as possible. And that's why I would stress it very much comes down to the comms and the pitch, how you roll this out. That's key to its success. You do get your test results in 15 minutes. If you don't hear anything, you are negative. If you are positive, you are told by our health and safety team that is the case. And as I touched on earlier, you are sensitively and professionally exited from the workplace. Sounds a little bit much. I don't know, not a force in any way. You are given, measures are implemented to ensure you can go and have a PCR test and wait for the results of that. And then we go from there. All the results are provided very confidentially to our health and safety director on a weekly basis, along with MI. I have never seen sight of that. I do not have to. I won't see sight of that. So that's one point to reassure any of your team about with regards to GDPR. One thing I would note from a practical perspective is complacency. So what with the vaccine rollout and what with testing, that does in no way replace the fact that COVID-19 secure measures in every way have to be still top of your agenda. It's the key agenda on all our management meetings. We talk about that first every morning with our management team, or certainly my team in here. It's the first agenda point. Reinforce that constantly because it can become a means to complacency. How did we broach with employees? We had that on the back of that initial BCP meeting, COVID meeting, we had a director comms, in fact, go from our company owner and founder, Mr. Peter Doan, demonstrating that our board and our senior level were on board and supporting the programme. And then that communication went out to the full business, even those at home. And likewise then, it went into every management meeting, and that same pitch of reassurance, safety and the benefits was conveyed. Importantly, we have our test on a Friday. Not everyone is in on a Friday. So for those that were agreeable to come in and it made sense, they do come in and have a slot. For those where it's just not feasible, we have in no way forced, but what we have arranged are alternative arrangements for them. So they get sent home a PCR test with specific arrangements for them dependent on their location. That ensures that they're getting tested as well as everyone that's on site on their allotted day. Albeit what I would say is that a PCR test as opposed to a lateral flow test, and the results take a bit longer. And also from a cost perspective, that is much more expensive, but absolutely worth the cost to ensure the full workforce are supported, tested, and for the safety of all. What advice would I give to any attendees today that are considering a similar approach? Well, surprisingly, I think I was slightly taken aback by how easy it was. Now, I don't know whether that's because we got the pitch right or because we're in a position where everyone that is here as it stands has to be here. Maybe it would be a different situation if the full workforce were on premise, but it has been quite easy. The key thing, however, is everyone being on board, the comms, the pitch, making people feel safe and doing it extremely sensitively and professionally. And that would be my number one tip to everyone. Remember, as part of this, be human. I know businesses will have an objective as to why they want to implement testing, but at the end of the day, the number one priority is for the safety of our staff and our businesses and our people. So make sure that comes across in your comms. And that would be me. Thanks, Lee.
Oh, thank you very much, Kate. I love the way that you were able to give some practical examples at an organisation level as a line manager, but also at an individual level too. So I'm sure our attendees will appreciate that. So thank you to all three speakers. We do have some questions in the Q&A already. So I will try my best with the support of my colleagues to get through as many of them as possible. And I've tried to group some of them together, so they might come in a different order, if that's okay. So there's a few questions around the place of testing. So I'm going to try and ask some of you those. And they are, so can rapid flow testing be done at home or only at a designated centre? Can employees do the test at home? We have engineers who don't come into a central location to be tested in the workplace. Can individuals do their tests at home before coming into work? And I'll leave that for now. There's another couple, but I might muddle up. So there's kind of legal implications to some of the employment law considerations to some of those, Matt. So maybe you could pick up on them first, and then maybe from a practical perspective, Kate?
Yeah.
In terms of where people are testing, I mean, the only real sort of legal implication really is from a data protection point of view. So ensuring that the data that's collected and kind of distributed on the back of that is handled securely and appropriately. There's nothing legally that says that they could only be tested within the workplace. And with schools going back in England today, you know, parents with children at school will be able to register and get home tests, for example. So, I mean, legally, there's nothing to stop it. It is just ensuring that we're not just sending things unnecessarily backwards and forwards through the post, really. That said, the post is relatively secure from that point of view. So, as long as, again, the information's collected properly, handled appropriately, no concerns with where the testing takes place.
Yeah, just to add to that, from as I understand it, and based on the testing we're having, the lateral flow test literally goes into a machine on site, and that's all undertaken by our third-party provider with their expertise and knowledge and so forth. So I certainly know that the programme we've gone down cannot be done at home. And those individuals who can't come in on their allotted day, they've actually been sent a PCR test home, which can be sent off in the post. As I understand it, that's the difference, Lee, in that the lateral flow test is quick. It has to be put through a machine. It's done very quickly. The PCR test can be done over a longer length of time and be submitted via the post. But that's my experience of it so far. Okay, thank you both. There is another question that's really about, I think it's about place of testing anyway. In a building where there are, so one of the questions was asked by someone who shares a building with other businesses, 6 other businesses, and the landlord, I'm paraphrasing here, the landlord is wishing to make lateral flow testing compulsory for all occupants of the building. What are the panel's views on that?
I mean, my background's very much employment law and landlord's degree and years ago, and something that I tried to forget since, in truth. So I can't really speak too much in terms of kind of the landlord and tenant relationship aspect of it. But I mean, to take it forward, I suppose, a few steps into the employment context. I mean, ultimately, if the landlord is able, under the terms of the tenancy, the lease and everything else, to physically restrict who can and can't enter the premises, if the landlord ultimately takes that decision that it's compulsory that everyone must be tested in order to physically enter the building, if as an employer you then have individuals that are refusing, you potentially end up with a dismissal situation if there is no way around that from your employment point of view. If your employee is no longer able to work for you, there's a whole host of considerations, as usual, that come into dismissals for what's then referred to as some other substantial reason, not least of which, and this is the sort of slightly unanswerable question at the moment, how long will this go on for? Whether or not the government take the view that by June, if enough people have been vaccinated, we will go back to business as usual, on the basis that the risk becomes that everybody has a minor illness or a relatively minor illness with this, or certainly not severe enough that other measures are needed. If the landlord is then saying, well, up until June, this is what we're going to require, it's unlikely that you're going to have the basis for a dismissal for some other substantial reason, given that it's March now and the individual won't be able to enter the building for a few months. So it will always turn on the rationale and the basis to it. But yeah, in terms of the landlord and tenant relationship, not something I would even want to hazard a guess at, in truth. But from an employment law point of view, potentially it could feed into other processes, but they are so fact specific, it would very much turn on exactly what is being required and exactly what the issues are in that particular scenario.
Yeah, Lee, not a great deal for me to add to what Matt said there, but an important question from employer to landlord is why? Why do you want to do this? What's your rationale? Sometimes, I wouldn't, often's probably a too forthright word, but sometimes with those open discussions, the landlord may in fact change their mind and say, well, okay, I appreciate maybe encouragement is the better line, but that's a really important question to ask the landlord to justify any action which the employer may subsequently take.
Okay, no, thank you, both of us. It's a very, very interesting question, and I hadn't thought about it from the type of law that you practice, Matt. So just kind of trying to pull together. So a couple of questions about the tests themselves, which Paddy might have been picked up in your area, but perhaps you could clarify. Is the lateral flow test required on a daily basis? And does a PCR test need to confirm a positive lateral flow test? The guidance on the lateral flow portal says it no longer needs to be confirmed with a PCR.
Yeah. So in terms of the first question, I mean, ultimately, I guess it's down to the individual when they decide how often to do the test. If Kate's saying they've chosen to do it once a week, it's ultimately down to the employer to make that decision. And obviously, depending on providers you use, it's implications of cost. If you decide to test X number of people every day, then that will certainly have implications. In terms of the PCR one, I would defer to, if the government portal says that, to best of my knowledge, it was PCR was required, but ultimately if the portal, I haven't actually got sight of it because I have to pretend to be an employer, which is quite difficult to do. So if the government guidance says that, I defer fully to that. So it's, and I think it might, if so, I'd like to know, because I think we'd have to update our guidance around there. But, so best of my knowledge, that was the case, but yeah, if guidance supersedes that. Okay, thank you, Paddy. So if I can give a direct a question to you, Kate, from someone that's very much about the practice. Have you met with much resistance from staff who haven't want to be tested? If so, how have you overcome this? And I know you touched on this a little bit in your session, but perhaps you could expand on that.
Yeah, interestingly, when we give everyone their allotted time, it wasn't actually explicit resistance. A handful just didn't go. So we actually identified the resistance by looking at who hadn't attended, and then we had individual conversations with those involved. I would quite honestly say across about 300 staff, there was about 10. So it wasn't masses. And I think the key to that, as I touched on, was how we pitched it and explained the benefits in advance of being given your allotted time. But quite honestly, all the reasonings were very different. As I touched on, some were GDPR, some were personal concerns, feeling of anxiety, some were not wanting to do it, quite simply. So it very much was a matter of individual discussions with those involved who were resisting to talk about what was concerning them. And as I touched on, very pleased to say, having had those discussions, they are all having the test now. Luckily, it might not always pan out that way, but it did in our case. As I say, whether that will change as more people return to the workplace over time and the pool of people being tested gets bigger, probably so, yes. But again, we'll take the same approach and address it on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, thank you for that, Kate. Now we are running out of time, but I'd quite like to touch on one other question, if that's okay with our panelists, because we've had a couple of questions about the employment contracts. So if I can direct those in first instance to you, Matt, please. So Joe was asking, so am I hearing right that if we want a bolt and braces approach and want to compel people to have a test, it would need to be in their contract? And then a kind of related question from the same individuals: if we dismiss and it's not in their contract, is this going to be harder to defend than if it is, even if deemed reasonable?
It's a difficult one. I'd be amazed if there are many employment contracts out there in truth that cover off testing, because as I say, before the pandemic, along with things like the concept of furlough, it just wasn't something that anybody ever had in mind. So I'd be amazed if there are many contracts that it's in. I mean, in truth, if it is reasonable and if we can sufficiently justify it, whether it's in the contract or not won't of itself prevent a dismissal from being fair. The point here, though, is that if it is in the contract, what you've effectively got is an individual that has already agreed to the testing. In signing up to their contract, the argument runs that they've already agreed to it. It's not an entirely equal playing field in terms of the negotiation over the employment contract, but they've signed up to it in essence. Even if it's in the contract, though, it's still not the be all and end all. It still needs to be reasonable from there. You still need to be implementing the clause reasonably, and you still need to have that justification and that backup as to why you are ultimately requiring that individual to do it. And then flip side, why you're ultimately then dismissing or at the very least taking disciplinary action where they're refusing to. So it doesn't need to be in the contract in order for it to be fair. It would be better if it is. I think personally at this stage, if it's not in the contract, but we ultimately feel as though it's something we would like to implement, I don't think I would look at thinking the contract at this point in order to try and get it in there before implementing the testing. I would look at implementing the testing and then, as we've already said, dealing with any exceptions as they arise, and then ultimately taking a view based on all of the factors that we've discussed, whether or not we are ultimately going to set it at the level of compulsory for that particular individual on that particular occasion.
Okay, no, thank you for that. Okay, we do have a couple of other topics of questions that I'd like to just go over by a minute or two. I hate the thought of people asking questions and not being answered. So it's quite an interesting one there that I would like to direct to you, Kate. How would an employer-led setup work if we wanted to implement our own testing programme? Do you know what is involved?
Okay. Well, first and foremost, to implement your own testing, we go back to the contract again. I'm kind of impinging on Matt's area here as well, so feel free to contribute, Matt. But to implement a testing programme, ideally employer-led, you would have it in the contract, ideally. And then the important point and the risk factor, as I would see it with employer-led testing, is ability to do the testing and accuracy of the results. Are the two main considerations, hence a real pull factor for us going to a third party. But what you would have to consider is really stringent training of those you're going to identify as the testers, making sure you had a stringent process in place to ensure for accurate results, because the last thing you want clearly in these circumstances are inaccurate results, and making sure that the stringency of your training and your testing and your processes are really explicit in your organisation to reassure those being tested of the fact that you're capable and able to do so. So it's a very different domain than what we're doing here, because we've got a third party, but certainly one that can be conquered, but with a few more obstacles, I would say, because you've got a lot of training to do and a bit more reassurance to do.
Okay, thank you for that. Matt, do you have anything briefly that you would like to add before we finish?
No, not really. I think I'll say no, then we'll talk anyway. So yes. a lot of this just comes down to reasonableness, which is always a bit of a sort of a, you know, what's reasonable is also how long's a piece of string sort of question, really. But the more that you do in terms of your thought process, why are we implementing it? How are we going about implementing it? What are we doing to sort of minimize the impact and everything else? That will all go towards that reasonableness test. Communication is key, as Kate's mentioned. Again, that helps towards reasonableness. The more open we've been, the more we've explained, the more reassurance we've provided, the easier it is to say that we're acting reasonably. And then it's just determining whether this, amongst a whole range of factors, is this enough ultimately if someone refuses to look to terminate their contract just around the testing itself.
Lee, it's probably worth
And that's always going to be a question of degree based on the specific circumstances.
Sorry, Matt, apologies there. I was just going to say it's worth, if anyone is thinking of doing it internally, to just check out how all the measures that the external providers do to make you feel reassured, like your own cubicles, like the instruction within your cubicles, like everything being set out in your cubicle, and the video, and, you know, just all those things that make it feel like a heightened and reassuring and safe process. They're really key. Some of it may well be smoke and mirrors, I don't know, but it makes you feel safe. And I think they're important factors to think about to make it a successful rollout.
Okay, no, thank you for that, Kate. We were doing really well by not talking over each other. Now, there's just a couple of quick things. So Matt, someone is asking, is it not just enough to consult with employees retesting rather than placing it in their contract?
Yeah, sorry if I wasn't clear enough on that. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it doesn't need to be in the contract. It would be better if it is, but it doesn't need to be. If you can demonstrate the need to do it and the reasonableness and everything, then. But I think what we're talking about here is the difference between implementing it and implementing it and making it compulsory. You can implement it, you know, in any event. You've still got the data protection considerations. If people are freely doing it, then there's much less of an issue. Obviously, than if you're getting into the realms of ultimately taking disciplinary action, if we're talking about dismissals for people that are refusing, if we're making it compulsory. But yes, it doesn't have to be in the contract. It would be better if it is. I doubt it will be. And as I said, I wouldn't necessarily look at changing the contract here before you implement testing. It just means that you still need to show, though, that it is reasonable in terms of what you're doing.
Okay, no, thank you for that point of clarification. I thought it was important to allow you to come back to that. We are really running out of time now. I think this is a quick question, Kate, just because it was very politely put by the individual. If there is time for Kate, I assume her organisation is offering full pay if there is a positive test result during isolation if unable to work from home.
Yeah, well, ironically, we've not actually had that where no one hasn't been able to work from home, would you believe? But yes, it hasn't come up as a concern because we've not had it. And yes, we would make arrangements to pay. So yeah, we have that covered. And that was one of the points of resistance as well. So, you know, we tackled that right at the outset.
Okay. Thank you for that. So we truly are out of time. What I can just say, we have answered most of the questions. For those that we haven't been able to answer as yet, please can I just always point you towards our frequently at FAQs on our Coronavirus Hub, because listening to discussions like this and to the questions that you're asking us allows us to truly think about what should be answered in the FAQs. So I will leave that there if that's okay, but thank you so much to our speakers who I'm sure you'll agree have shared great insight, knowledge and expertise on a vast array of issues and being really genuine in their responses. But it is such a fast moving environment and we don't always have the answers, but hopefully we've provided many answers and areas to consider today. Thank you to all of you that have submitted a question. There's clearly lots for organisations and employers to consider. The webinar will be available on demand later. The slides will be made available. We do point you towards our Coronavirus Hub and also to the solutions that are available through HR Inform. I know that a couple of people asked where the sample policies will be held. That's where you will find them. And do keep an eye out for future webinars that we are hosting, including the one that I mentioned earlier that is being planned for next week. And just a final reminder to you about our wellbeing support for members in the UK and in Ireland, with the 24/7 telephone helpline, and you'll see from the slides the other the other benefits that are available to you, but in particular we wanted to focus on the workplace wellbeing solution. So thank you very much to everyone. Have a good afternoon. Thank you.